Let me welcome everybody to the second in our African Writers in Conversation series. It's hosted by the Council on African Studies at the Macmillan Centre for International and Area Studies at Yale University. As I say, this is the second webinar in our series where we speak to African creative writers located all over the world. And this morning, I'm delighted to welcome the novelist Masande Ntshanga, who's joining us from Cape Town. Well, Masande Ntshanga was born in East London, South Africa, and was educated at the University of Cape Town, where he completed his bachelor's degree in English, film and media. And he also did his master's degree in creative writing there. And he also served as a creative writing fellow there. And since then, he's won multiple fellowships and awards, including PEN International New Voices Award in 2013. That was for a short story called Space. And he was a finalist for the Kane Prize for African Writing in 2015. His articles and reviews have appeared in many periodicals, including the Los Angeles Review of Books and Rolling Stone magazine. In 2018, his first novel, The Reactive, which we'll be hearing about in more detail today, won the Betty Trask Award, which is given by the Society of Authors to first novels written by writers under the age of 35 who live in a current or former Commonwealth country. His most recent novel, Triangulum, was published in South Africa last year, and that was shortlisted for the 2020 Nomo Award for Best Speculative Fiction by Africans. Both of these novels, The Reactive and Triangulum, have attracted considerable critical acclaim. And The Reactive has been described by the novelist Naomi Jackson as a searing, gorgeously written account of life, love, illness, and death in South Africa. It's been described as brilliant and disquieting. A reviewer in the Pretoria News said its characters were, quote, the real heroes in today's struggle. As we'll hear in a moment, it tells the story of three youths who, alongside their regular jobs in Cape Town, run a sideline business selling antiretroviral medications to HIV patients in Cape Town. And at one point in the novel, the friends have an encounter with a terrifying stranger who's ostensibly a client for their drugs, but is more like a supernatural force who takes them on a soul journey that moves the novel into a visionary, speculative world beyond realism. Well, I'm going to hand over to Masande now to talk more about The Reactive, and he'll talk a little bit about his own work and then read from the novel, and then we'll open up the conversation to you in the audience for a Q&A. So please make use of the Q&A function, and you can post your questions up, and I'll present those to Masande as we go through the session. So really like to welcome you today, Masande. Okay, so we seem to have got a block there. Let's just wait a little while.
I'm sorry, Stephanie, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Yes, you're just blocked for a little while there. It's great to hear you. That's good.
Okay. Sorry, I think I lost my connection towards the end there.
That's okay. Please go ahead and you can introduce your work, and I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Stephanie. This is quite a different and new experience for me in the sense. It's almost like speaking, out into a void. Usually, you can kind of see, your audience, the people who've come to listen to you speak. And what I like to always do is to start off by, showing my appreciation. It means a lot to me that you took the time to come and do this. And it's one of those things that, I really do miss doing, before the virus. And I don't know, I've really been looking forward to it. And it means a lot to me to be, in the presence of people who engage not only with my work, but, who find the sorts of things that I find in literature as well. So thank you, and thanks again, Stephanie. So I think in regards to my work, I have been more and more kind of understanding it as something that I do to try and make my environment and my experience of my environment make sense to me. I was born in a really kind of chaotic period in our country's history during a national state of emergency, actually. And at this time, my mother lived in Bisho, which was the capital of what used to be called the Bantustan, or a homeland. And what these were basically were dummy states which kind of professed Black statehood and Black independence, but really were economically dependent on white South Africa. And it was just a method so that the apartheid regime seemed as if it was making concessions when they weren't. So a significant amount of my childhood was spent there in relative confusion in terms of what was happening around me. And I think that's kind of what I tried to channel in my story that won the New Voices Award that's definitely mentioned. And later on, I would go back to and revisit these themes and these settings because it's a constant exploration, I guess, of what it means to be Black and to have been positioned where I was positioned historically, coming into the new society. And, what it meant also to kind of immigrate into South Africa after democracy, our first elections, and, making sense of that transition into what was essentially like a formerly, white republic, and, with more or less, very Eurocentric norms. And yeah, so I've always been interested in that, this relationship between history, the state, and the individual. And I think that's what I try to explore the most in my work. With the reactive in particular, I was very interested in this idea of mapping, one young man's consciousness within this context, and kind of visiting all the things, that might have informed it, and how, just as I often do, that character might have been trying to figure out, what kind of identity to fashion for themselves, and also if they're going to project themselves into the society, how to approach it, and whether or not, in fact, it is open to receiving them and including them. So I think generally those are the themes that I work around. I'm also very interested in this idea of, how to kind of interpret the relationship between like the psychology of the individual in relation to oppressive systems, and also while at the same time just in relation to illness and in relation to family. And so I'm pretty much still on that project. I've done it, I think, for my last 2 works and a work I'm finishing off now. But I think with what should be my 3rd novel, I'm taking a slight, detour. I think it's going to be more historically heavy, so reaching back probably like, I don't know, 200 or so years. So yeah, that's an abridged version of what I try to do with writing. And of course, what's really important while doing this, since it was never just solely an intellectual process for me. In fact, I came to writing and I came to reading out of a need for solace, and I was able to find it. And so a large part of what inspires me to write is being able to reach and offer the same thing, to readers, to people who engage it. And, and if it can inspire in the way that I have been inspired, by really great writers that I came across, then all the better, So I think, I try to do both things. It's both a way to think through these themes, but it's also an act of, communication and communion. So I'm going to read from The Reactive, my first novel. It was released in 2014 here in South Africa. So it's been a bit of a while, and 2016 in the US. It's really, it was my first kind of attempt, my first exploration, of these themes that I mentioned, and exploring them in practice. But also I think it's a book in which I kind of approached with this idea that, if this was ever to be the last thing I ever wrote, would I be content? And I know like some people might think that, it's a very, young way to think, or a late 20s way to think. But for me, it was that important, it was important to make work that was meaningful to me and that others could derive meaning from, So I tried to put in as much in it as I could in terms of what I'd observed about my society and what conclusions I guess I'd come to. So I'm just going to start reading. I'm not going to give much of a synopsis except to say that, it's three friends in Cape Town and a young man who's mourning the death of his brother. So I will be reading from the very first part of the book, actually, the intro. 10 years ago, I helped a handful of men take my little brother's life. I wasn't there when it happened, but I told Lutando where to find them. Earlier that year, my brother and I had made a pact to combine our initiation ceremonies. This was back in 1993. Alti was only 17 then. He was broad of shoulder, but known as a wimp at Ngangalizwe High. My brother was good looking in a funny way that never helped him any. And like me, he was often called Ibari or useless by the older guys in the neighborhood. LT was bad with girls too. Most of them had decided against us pretty early. I don't know, maybe it's strange that I remember that about him most of all. I suppose my brother was handed the lousy luck of every guy in our family except our dad, who'd thrown us into different wombs one year after the other. We had cousins like that too. All of them dealt a similar hand. In the end, it was winter when Lutando went to the hills to set things straight for himself. He went up thinking I would follow behind him. It was raining when the bakkie took him on its back and drove him up the dirt trail. Inside the camp, they put him in line with a set of boys he shared a classroom with. Then they took out their blades. Afterwards, they nursed him for a week and he kicked and swore at them for another 2. They called him the Screamer, they told us later, when we gathered to put him inside the earth. Maybe it was meant with tenderness, I thought, the kind of tenderness men could keep between themselves in the hills. One morning, they said, my brother had failed to make the sounds they'd come to know him for. Lutando wasn't due out for another 2 days. The sky had been an empty blue expanse, easy on their duties around Eziko, and they'd missed his peculiar fussiness. When they walked into his hut, one after the other, they found a memory instead of the man they were out to make. That was my little brother, LT, dead at 17, and I've never forgotten it was me who put him there. I never went back home after we buried him. This isn't a story about me and my brother from the Transkei, about the Mda boys from Mthatha or the village of Qokolweni, where my grandmother's bones lie polished and buried next to her ma's. Instead, I want to tell you about what happened to me in Cape Town after Luthando had taken his death. It's where I went to school and tried to make something of myself. It's also where I began to reconsider what my hands had made, and my telling of how it broke won't take us very long. I went to college 2 times in my life. I might as well begin with how things went for me there. I first attended the university in Rondebosch, just up the road from the main strip. And when I dropped out of my journalism degree, I enrolled at the Technikon in town, where I got my science diploma and my sickness. I had an equity scholarship. There had been plenty of those to go around for whoever looked the way I did back then. I got through on mostly average grades too, like most of the guys in my class. When the year came to an end, there was a bunch of us who'd file into the fees office again to fill out all the forms required of boys who shared my skin tone. It didn't take much to go to school for free in those days, or rather to trade on the pigment we were given to carry. I think I did all right if you consider everything else, and I graduated with an upper second class pass in the end. I still have that diploma sitting somewhere in my flat in Observatory. Now what else? In between university and tech, I spent close to half a year at Budvuyo's place. 2 weeks after dropping out of the university, I tried to go home, but I couldn't set foot inside my mother's house. The home I'd known since I was a child was barred to me. There could have been a tapestry of fire that flowed over each of our walls that day. In fact, thinking about it now, even that feels like an understatement. My mother felt disgraced by my decision to leave the university and my bachelor's degree behind me in Rondebosch. It was too soon, she complained, first over the phone and then again in person. For a few moments, she even refused to turn her face up towards me. Instead, Ma arranged for me to enter the home of a relative. Budvuyo was known as a great mechanic, a recovering alcoholic, and someone who'd been a doting stepfather to the little brother I'd helped to kill. He'd met my aunt, Sis Funeka, when Luthando was only 10 years old. And before then, sticking his hands into rusting bonnets had taken Budvuyo to Okinawa as a man of barely 20. Pushed forward by the locomotive of a lucrative Toyota scholarship, he'd gone to the city of Kyoto at the age of 24 before coming back and accepting too many drinks on the house in a tavern called Silver's. That was in Bisho, during the decline of the homeland years, and they'd served him on a cloth-covered tray every morning after he'd taken his table. It was no more than a month, people said, before my uncle was undone. There were decades that would nearly fell him after that. Budvuyo barely standing on his 2 feet around the neighborhood, and Budvuyo tottering on street corners next to the highway in Ntshanga. He was often seen with his toes busting out through the smiles on his black and blue gumboots, his head lolling as wispy as an old hornet's nest over his shoulders. Now, my mother told me, having wrung himself dry, and maybe for good this time, Budvuyo lived with his second wife in Danun. They had 2 small children and her older son from a previous marriage, all of them born with bright eyes and strong teeth, and each glowing with the promise of long-lasting health. For her part, my aunt had passed away shortly after we buried her. Sis Funeka had had a cancer eating away at her throat, and I suppose it had grown too impatient with the rigorous hold of her grief. In the end, it had been a punishment for me to be sent to Danun. I had known that even then, but thinking of my little brother, of Luthando, I'd made myself accept the idea. And so I went to Danun like my mother wanted me to. and ended up staying there for 6 months. I suppose some things happened when I was out there too. And I drew close to those folks who'd taken me in. The subject of Lutando came up as I thought it would. And in my gratitude to them, I made a promise to put Vuyo and his household. Now, close to 8 years later, I receive a text message from my uncle that reminds me of the words we shared back then and of the promise I made on a night so long ago, I can hardly put it together from memory. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You've got 30 people out there who are all applauding you as well. Thank you, Masande. That was wonderful.
Thank you so much.
And questions are starting to come in already in the Q&A bar, so thank you, and please keep those questions coming in. We've got some questions that have been submitted in advance actually by students on the African Literature course at Yale. There's some people are really interested in your how you think about Cape Town in your writing, in the reactive. Mpho Molefi, she asked if you could speak more about your can you talk more about your decision to mark the feel of this particular era in South Africa, with marking it with details about everyday life and the physical space of Cape Town. So she was interested in how you don't, apart from the one scene of real parody that you get in the reactive, where the characters put on masks of various political leaders, including Robert Mugabe. But Mpho is really interested in how you do not gesture to key political figures like Thabo Mbeki or the history of apartheid, not sort of explicitly in the novel, but through details about everyday life and the physical space of Cape Town. And quite a few people were really interested in the Cape Town that you evoke in the novel.
I think, yeah, definitely. I at first, actually, it's quite interesting because in the beginning, I wanted to kind of write this novel about, other themes that are included in the book, such as, trauma and recreational drug use and, meditations and technology, etc. And the idea I had for that was to kind of write the setting in such a way that, the city could be interchangeable with any other world city, and I mean, a lot of people refer to Cape Town sometimes like that, which is basically kind of, which alludes to its cosmopolitan nature in certain sectors, I suppose. And so I was kind of very invested in writing this very modern 21st century novel that kind of had that at its basis. And I toiled away at that for a little bit. And even though I could kind of see the kind of formal, tools that I would be interested in, this idea of stream of consciousness and, making that interact with tinkering with your own consciousness through drugs, all of this stuff was coming through, but the book to me kind of felt as if it had no pulse. It wasn't inhabited, it didn't feel alive, and for a while I wondered, what I was doing wrong. And I realized that, I was actually kind of looking away, from my society, which is something that happens a lot, for example, Cape Town, or at least in the sense that I tried to write about it, felt to me, a little as if it hadn't been written enough about. We do have some key novels that are set here, and they, speak to the place in different eras and with different approaches. But the idea, that comes with needing to look away, I think, as being intimidated, with how to make sense of the society and how to where you would place yourself. because it's incredibly fractured, and a lot of people like inhabited even the city itself, Cape Town, in a way in which, their lives run parallel, even though they share, the built environment and everything else. So the challenge really was to look closer at the society and to be able to try as best as I could to eliminate my blind spots about it. And another third point is that even though lots of places in South Africa feel underwritten or not written enough about in detail, at the same time, we also contend with the fact that we live in a society that is, that after democracy kind of invented a new nationalism, right? We had a campaign about the Rainbow Nation. And one of the things that did, that came in with Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu is that it turned us into a populace that repeatedly, told the story of our country to ourselves, So a lot of, how we describe the country, a lot of how we describe our cities, unfortunately falls into the ambit of that really exhausted language. So part of the challenge is, for writers to be able to cut through all of that and find, something new to say and something vivid. And an activity like that takes a personal investment. It can't come from, arm's length, unfortunately, even if you're like technically brilliant, because it's also a process of appraising yourself, I found. So that's kind of what inspired me to take a really close look at Cape Town during that era. And also I didn't want it particularly to be like our era, I still wanted it to be like very early, after the end of the 20th century, and in an era that was fast becoming murky for us, which is like post-apartheid, directly post-apartheid. And yeah, so even like engaging with that as a writer formally was very giving to me. After I'd yielded to that impulse, I was constantly surprised by how much I remembered. And, because it's fascinating, really. It's a city of so many overlaps, from being extremely cosmopolitan to still having a very present, colonial heritage. So I think that's what I was going for with that.
Yeah, thank you very much. The Cape Town that you present, it's interesting what you say, because you turn towards subcultures and underclasses and the margins. It's quite interesting, and it reminded me a little bit of K. Selwadika's 13 Cents, also another great iconic Cape Town novel. And there's quite a few novels from those early years that you're talking about, the first years of this century, that focus on broken men and male violence, and including rape, and often showcase misogyny as well, and the ways particularly in which Black men in South Africa, the new South Africa, are relegated to the margins and to underclasses and peripheries of economies. And so there's a sense of kind of lost generation and broken people, particularly around men, masculinity. And I was really struck. I was struck by many things in Reactive. One is the way that you use very violent, beautifully violent metaphors and similes, particularly for the natural environment, and it's really noticeable. But the other thing that really struck me is the way that the relationship between the three friends in the novel is filled with a lot of love and physical tenderness, rather than the kind of violence that you see in the intimate spaces portrayed in those other novels that I've mentioned. One might think of Dog Eat Dog by Nick Mlongo as well, which I think is set in Johannesburg. But so I'm really interested in the connection. You've got this lovely friendship bubble of tenderness with the three characters that you portray. It's quite asexual-ish compared to those other texts. I suppose the question would be, do you see subcultures as potentially offering spaces beyond or outside the violence? Or are they kind of produced by those inequalities that you've talked about?
I think I see them as potentially, whereas a lot of people might think of them as, retreats, I think they also have, the potential to offer refuge. And I mean, like I've been involved in quite a few myself, over the years, and at different points trying to figure out different things. And I think what I've found really wonderful, and I suppose in its way, courageous, people who sometimes have a willingness to kind of, pause and enter the space, just almost like a laboratory where they can tinker, with different definitions, of themselves and the relationship to the greater society and the relationship, to other people, and also experiment with different bonds, which might not be as conditional as some of the bonds that they used to, even in the families that they born to. So I think, yeah, I identify them as like stop-off points, for possibilities. And I think there's a great amount of hope in that. And yeah, and I'm just really, fascinated by the kinds of things that people imagine within those spaces, and the kinds of things that they make us, reevaluate as well. And it was very important for me to have those relationships. So I'm really glad that you picked up on that. Actually, it differs from reader to reader. Sometimes people are a little bit concerned about the lifestyle of these characters, and they actually overlook what I thought was what was important about it. In fact, I've often thought it's even more important than the glue. Even though one reader did ask me whether or not the glue was a metaphor, like as in it's gluing them together. But yeah, that was extremely important to me. It was the kind of book where I also wanted, the narrator, Linda Nati, to be someone who, as troubled as it might be, was also offering the reader, if they wanted, the same kind of intimacy, the same kind of space, for 100 somewhat pages. So that was very important in that book. And I think it's important to my work as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Claire Lee, one of the students on the African literature course where we've read your novel, she was really interested in how the emphasis on Linda Nati's name keeps coming back to the notion that this is a girl's name. My parents gave me a girl's name, it's a girl's name. And Claire was really interested in what that means in the context of the novel. And because again, it's reiterated right at the end, isn't it, in the closing page? It isn't fully kind of explained in the text itself. So could you say a little bit more about that, about Linda Nati's name?
Yeah. So Linda Nati has, a unisex name, but his mother kind of names him after, the daughter of a friend who just, at the dawn of democracy looks like a very studious, very promising child, with a lot of prospects, ahead of her. This is during the era which we commonly refer to as like the golden age, of our democracy, which was filled with this euphoria and this like profound sense of optimism in terms of where we were headed. And it was understandable because, you know, we had just survived, you know, something nightmarish. So, but this is deliberate in the sense that it also brings to question, you know, this idea that Lutando perishes, like during his circumcision rites, primarily which is concerned, it's a rites of passage, you know, for young Xhosa boys, you know, it inaugurates them into manhood. They get to learn a lot about, you know, what that means and how it's fashioned. And there's been a lot of discussion, you know, around whether or not it needs to kind of be revisited, expanded, or reformed. And but this wasn't necessarily concerned like with that, although it was included in it. But I think it exists there as a thing to kind of, you know, to interrogate contemporary ideas around Black masculinity, you know, and how those translate from our communities and into, you know, the society that we're trying to integrate to. So Linda Nati exists as a character who has not, you know, gone to his rites of passage ceremony. And in a lot of ways, also, he's very, you know, he deviates, you know, from a more mainstream understanding of Black masculinity. And I was very interested in what happens, you know, at that point, at points of departure, whether or not, you know, they kind of inspire us to rethink the thing, to reconsider what that means. So yeah, the thing about the name exists for those purposes, and to kind of, yeah, to problematize this idea of an essential Black manhood or masculinity.
Thank you. And following on from that, I was reminded of Ngugi's novel, The River Between, when I read about the circumcision in your novel, because Ngugi also has a character who dies, a girl who dies under circumcision. And, you know, there might be a sort of moral expectation that therefore, you know, one would condemn circumcision and see it as something that should be outlawed. And, you know, that's not the direction that either Ngugi takes or you take in your novel. It seems to me that you're asking some questions about whether traditions like circumcision and the knowledge that comes with them do provide continuities for men in the present. And, you know, thinking about your setting, that you've got Cape Town with the uninitiated men kind of needing to kind of go and get knowledge elsewhere. And I was really interested in whether you see there are continuities with the past that perhaps, not to impose a moral reading on your novel, but whether you think there are systems of knowledge from the past that do merit recuperation and visibility in the present, albeit in perhaps mediated slightly different forms, and whether that's one of the sort of ways of reading how you present circumcision in the novel.
Yeah. I definitely think so. And I think the tragedy of it really, and even for me, you know, personally, is that there's always a need to reevaluate, you know, there's always a need to keep asking questions. And so there will always be a need for those kind of knowledge systems and the knowledges that they attained, you know, they'll always need to be present. But it took me the longest time to realize that, you know, the biggest problem in doing that is when we tend to look either back, or let's say rather to look at, you know, the other, it matters how we see it, you know, it matters how we see it. And I think with like interventions like decoloniality, you know, which understands that knowledge is, you know, exist in parallel simultaneously, and each of them are kind of valid, then it bears the question that, you know, in order to extricate the knowledges from these alternative systems, it would take engaging with people who are immersed in them, to the extent where we're able to really, you know, get the scope of the worldview and the perspective on them, instead of kind of looking at them, you know, from proximity to the center. Because I don't think what we tend to look back on in cases like that is very accurate. So a character like Linda Knight is someone who kind of, you know, stops off at that almost border, almost liminal space where there could be something else and something bigger. But unfortunately, you know, for him, he hasn't kind of been exposed to the type of, I don't know, insights, you know, that could take him further. But of course, you know, where the book ends, it's quite possible that he goes on to do that. So I do think the systems are definitely valid. And I think it's important actually that more should be done to bring them out and to integrate them, you know, and of course, to reform what doesn't work the same way that we have to reform what doesn't work, you know, in current predominant knowledge systems.
Thank you. This leads directly to a question from John Reed Jackson, and she's thinking about the reactive and about triangulum as well as kind of experimental futuristic writing, triangulum. And then you just say, and also obviously picking up on what you just said about writing a historical novel as well. So she's really interested in, you know, now you say you're leaping hundreds of years back for your third book, and asks, what do you see as a thread, if any, that connects these investments in the future and the distant past? And she's very, and of course then we put the reactive in there as well, with its quite a presentist imagination, although it's very speculative as well. So that's a great question about, you know, perhaps connects to what you've just said around, you know, deep history continuities, things that need drawing out, you know. So you've got futuristic writing and historical writing, and a very present novel as well. So would you like to say a little bit about that?
Firstly, that's a great question. Thank you. I appreciate that and picking that out. Yeah, I think it's pretty accurate. I think my experience and my perception of South African history in general is as a continuum, you know, as, you know, something that's ongoing. I think about my own life, for example, and things that used to be kind of commonplace for us as children in the late 80s and early 90s. Was like, before we went out to play, we'd get warned not to play with, you know, loaves of bread that seemed to just be left on the side of the road, that there might be a bomb in there. And I remember this at the time as a kid being told that certain coins, if you like drop them against the tar and they didn't bounce, it meant that they were bombs. And, you know, it's the kind of thing that also filtered into how we played, you know, with water bottles that would like fill and pretend that they were Molotov, you know, cocktails. So all this kind of like childlike imitation of what was going on around us. So yeah, basically pretty much a country, you know, at the brink of civil war. And it's strange to think about it now, because moving from the homeland to South Africa, as it were, was a matter of moving to the nearest town, you know, for us. And, you know, of course, it took a lot of integration and it was a very weird experience. But at the same time, you know, that house that belongs in, you know, this really awful like period in the 20th century is still there and it still stands. And I think that's kind of, that's my experience, you know, of what it's like to be here. And also like I mentioned earlier with Cape Town itself, how, the legacy of colonialism here, including monuments to it. Like from where I live, basically, I walk past quite a lot of, VOC, the Dutch East India Company monuments, and history, basically. And at the same time, interacting with other different parts of the city, which have, which allude to histories that belong to different groups of people. So I think it's all an attempt to come to an understanding of what it means to be in this location, called South Africa, and to reconcile all of the things that flow into it, all of the different people, all of the different cultures, and all of the conflicts that have given it its particular face. And I think I'm invested in doing that because, for one, growing up, I never got exposed, to a lot of it. I think the education back then, like, swung from being like propagandists and heavily influenced by white supremacy to kind of being, something that decided to kind of elide race and its existence. And in doing so, continue to kind of to marginalize, the majority. So this is also a process of discovery for me to be able to go back and to learn things, that I never got the chance to learn. And from those things, to have a better understanding of the present, and also to try to basically kind of, to have some raw material to form an insight on what the future could possibly be, basically.
Thank you. And quite a lot of people are asking questions about the emphasis you place on memory in your writing, particularly thinking about the reactive, that the whole narrative, Rihanna Turner talks about how the whole narrative is structured and disseminated through memory. And
yeah.
That does connect with what you're saying, really. And she was interested in what the pressures were for you, what made it necessary to write the narrative according to the chronology of Linda Nati's memories. And then other people have really are asking questions that kind of relate to what you're saying about the sort of meshing, mobility, merging, that you've written a novel here where, as Maddie Blaney and Rebecca Amonal point out, that there's no speech marks, there's no kind of marking between dialogue and narrative and direct speech and narration, and so I wonder if you could talk about those sort of stylistic features, and also, does the way that you write reflect the emphasis that you place on the role of memory, or the importance of memory as history, or is there a kind of connection between these things?
That's great. Again, thank you. Yeah, I think definitely, and memory was particularly important, I think, for this book, in the sense that I wanted us to experience, the narrative through how Linda Nati structured the world, how he perceived it. And I'm really happy that you actually mentioned all the other stylistic choices, because they were all kind of coming from the same goal. With this novel, I wanted it to kind of be an inside out experience, of South Africa through, one young man, early in the 21st century, on the brink, of a great change, which I think for me which is indicated by the fact that the liberation government could actually, serve its own agenda, in lieu of the people. And with the HIV/AIDS policies at the time, we saw that for the first time kind of playing out on a large scale. So I thought it was a very important, point in our recent history. So that was my setting. But what I wanted for the experience was for it to be as immersive as possible. I wanted to cultivate the sense of intimacy and to mimic, as best as I could, how we interpret experience, in life. And so I was working to distill that as much as I possibly could in the form of literature. And I mean, I'm not the first person to not, denote speech, but I think it worked really well from, at least when I was reading back, as I was writing, because firstly, it kind of challenged me to make the dialogue as realistic as possible or as true to the characters as possible so that the reader could follow it, which for me was a prompt to like make them, even more authentic than I could, doing something else. And also, I kind of wanted to remove, the author from the book as much as I possibly could. I didn't want, my work to show and, and my presence to kind of glide over the pages. And of course, you can never really, get rid of that. But yeah, it was very much in favor of this idea of making the book as immersive as possible and us getting as close to Linda Nati as possible as well, through his memories and also how his memories, influence what he sees in front of him. I have a friend of mine who calls it hauntology, as in he's haunted, but yeah, it's kind of living in the presence, of memories. And yeah, it was incredibly important, and it does fit into this larger project I have of trying to, consolidate, this historical continuum and what it's meant for us.
Before we move into your second reading, which is going to conclude our session, a few people are asking about the really powerful, visionary, hallucinogenic, futuristic scenes in the reactive that the critics almost avoid. It's really, you can almost see people moving where you've got the client, the masked man, who kind of gives these visions to each of the three characters. And Irene Vasquez asks if you could talk about the sort of embodiment, disembodiment, these speculative scenes, the voice of the man. There's a way, I sort of interpreted these as you really expressing a sort of sense of the limitations of the traditional realist novel with these scenes, and I'm fascinated by how critics do evade talking about it, and I wonder if you would like to say something about those scenes, these more speculative scenes, the voice of the man.
Yeah, it really came from this idea that, as much as I had gathered my material to write in regards to Cape Town, I also had to submit that there's a very strong current of unknowability, that exists in the city. And something that I've experienced as points of possibility, and I wanted that unknowability, to kind of be represented in the novel. But at the same time, it's something that, with further investigation, kind of, is explained and it makes sense. But it was important in terms of that, in terms of themes, but also formally, it was important for me to create a character who could give that kind of, that feel and that element to the book. I've had some people kind of describe the stories that he tells, kind of fables that he tells the characters at some point in the novel as, like magical realism. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's magical realism, but I would definitely attest to the fact that it was pretty much, a kind of tribute to that leg of African writing. You know, as a student and studying African literature, at some point, you know, you're exposed to, you know, writers like Ben Okri and Zeksim Da, and, you know, they come with an enormous amount of hefts, you know, because they are kind of interacting with this thing that we were discussing earlier, which is evoking and resuscitating, you know, alternative knowledge systems that come from, you know, the side of people who are like generally marginalized from knowledge production. So it's an incredibly important work, and I always loved this feel that they gave to it, you know, which was that it was very intuitive, and it was just kind of a different way of knowing, and it was driven by, you know, instinct, and was very imaginative. And so I kind of wanted also the book to include, you know, that amount of, or rather that nature of knowledge as well, because Linda Nazi and his friends, you know, when they're in the city, you know, what they consume, whether or not, you know, it's Albert Camus or like Silver Surfer comics, you know, there's this knowledge that they fashioned for themselves, you know, with a lot of, you know, Western references, and that's all good and well. But I just wanted to also like indicate, you know, where there might be limitations for that, and where like alternative, you know, ways of knowing, perceiving, you know, might arrive from. So yeah, that was an experiment in that.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned that you're finishing off your third novel now, and you said you described it as historically heavy, and it would be really marvelous if you read something, maybe from that, maybe from something else you're working on. We know we're in for a treat. If you'd like to read us something something current.
Well, it depends. It depends on how much time we have. Actually,
we have about 10 minutes.
About 10 minutes.
It's not much time.
Yeah. Let me see. I could find. I have another project actually that's very close to completion, but it's a much shorter thing. It's not the novel that I think maybe I could read a little bit from that. And I think it kind of, it's in communication with some of the themes that we were talking about. So it's a story that is set in 2026. It's set in 2026 in Johannesburg. I guess I'll just kind of read about 2 sections from it. Okay. I hadn't heard from the engineer in years. I'd grown up with him, first as an accomplice and then as a brother. But ever since we'd entered adulthood, our lives had run parallel, no longer connected. From a distance, I'd kept up with his success as a programmer and tech entrepreneur. I knew that he'd helped build the government's new data infrastructure in the wake of the coronavirus, that he'd done well for himself. It was a Friday, the 6th of November, 2026. I was speaking to a small class of game design students at a media institute in central Johannesburg, delivering a lecture on how to translate images into narrative, when I felt the first text vibrate against my chest. The previous night, my wife, Mihlali, had asked me if I was feeling alone in the city again. In Johannesburg, she meant. For the past 2 weeks, she'd been in Cape Town visiting her sister. My first thought was that she hadn't been convinced when I told her I was learning to cope. Not that she was wrong, since I wasn't. Then the second vibration came. It was an intimate class and I could speak in my normal voice, which I liked, but that also meant the phone was too loud for the room. The students laughed when I switched it off. In my car afterwards, I unlocked it and saw the text hadn't come from Mihlali, but from an unfamiliar number. I read them from the top, 3 links and a note telling me we should meet the following morning. The signature read, "The engineer." It was him, I thought. I remembered that night in 2006 at the gaming convention when we were closer than brothers, but only an hour from being estranged. I remembered the LAN party, how no one else in the room was Black. My wife and I used to be mired together in a newsroom at a national paper before my first script got picked up by a game studio in Cape Town. For years, I hadn't known what would come of the computer game I was working on. And as a result, I told no one about it, even Mihlali. It was premised on the construction of different civilizational models. In it, users nurtured a humanoid population from single-cell organisms to intelligent life before creating institutions to safeguard them. The feature that made it distinct from other life simulation games was that it gathered data from users as much as it was influenced from direct input. It used their photographs to influence the design of the humanoid. It also surveilled their internet usage and communicated to them through a chatbot therapist, both of which affected the status of their populations, showing up in the game as ratings of individual happiness, communal happiness, freedom, and knowledge. This influenced which civilizations emerged for the user, ranging from competitive societies to conservationist communities. I'd anticipated the surveillance in the game to be controversial, but for the most part, the feature went ignored. The times had changed, I thought, and the theft of data no longer concerned us. Instead, it was the question at the center of the game itself, how we wanted to live, that drew the studio's attention. Then the markets, then the engineers. I told my wife about it after I'd sent it to Cape Town, and Mihlali helped me wait. Then, after 5 years of development, it came out. Even though I'd nursed a reasonable amount of doubt against it, the game stood its ground. It was a success with critics and sold well enough for me to approach Mihlali and suggest we quit the newsroom. The two of us had been worn through from reporting, I thought, and we were aging, marching towards our tombs. There was a contract on the table for the team in Cape Town to develop a sequel with a game studio with offices in Quebec and Maastricht. Then that night, I made sure we had enough wine, enough for me to deliver the news and enough for Mihlali to hear it. That enough time had passed since our last fight. It would be precarious, she said, you being a writer and me a housewife. I waited. Her pragmatism was a draw for me. Mihlali knew that, but I could also tell she was enthusiastic beneath it. No, I think it's a beautiful idea, she said. And then we made love. I told the engineer to meet me at a farmer's market in the north of Johannesburg, where my wife and I often met with friends who were visiting us from out of town, but he hadn't arrived. That was close to an hour ago. I asked the bartender at one of the stalls if she had a stock of non-alcoholic beers that weren't from craft breweries, and she winced like I'd expected her to. Fine, but don't tell me about its recipe or background, I sighed. There was a plastic sheet dividing us, and the market had been sectioned into quadrants for distance. The bartender smiled. I paid for a bottle of red ale and walked to a corner a few meters removed from the food stalls, to the left of a vacated bandstand, where I sat and thought about the engineer and wondered what he was like, if he was troubled or content. Ever since we were children, growing up in the Ciskei, we'd both nursed a libidinal hunger for machines, our first love being circuit boards. Pixels were intoxicants. Existence felt like a cage, and gaming was an implement that clawed us out. It strengthened how we imagined. Days after playing through a cartridge on our bootleg Nintendos, we'd still be deconstructing its plot lines and elaborating on the fates that had befallen its cast. Homeland geeks, we were both born at the end of the 20th century, in 1986, the year of Chernobyl, months before P.W. Botha declared a nationwide state of emergency, detaining 1,000 protesters in an attempt to push back the liberation of our parents. In the aftermath, lathered in petroleum jelly and dressed in discount store bibs that caught teaspoons of our milk and sorghum porridge, we grew up in the ashes of a thwarted revolution, scheduled first to be scalded inside the cruel experiment of assimilation. Mother raised and father deserted, we shared an alliance of absence. Inward, we were kicked and shoved for being too tender amongst our own. In a silent pact, we agreed to compete, to treat our schoolwork like a video game and establish a high score for it, staving off boredom and distracting ourselves from the torments that arrived at the hands of our peers. Then we'd fill the rest of our time with AC adapters, RF cords, and cartridges. PE teachers called us lovers to mark our resolve, but the engineer was a brother to me. I'd grown stronger on his mother's porridge. I looked at the links he'd sent me in his texts, thinking back to an old arcade machine we used to crack at a shop 2 blocks down from his house, after we'd moved from the homeland to the suburbs, and of a stack of foreign gaming mags we'd once found tossed with a neighbor's pawn. How no one else knew what a 3DO was. I thought of World Heroes Perfect, Neo Geo, SNK versus ADK, how packed the shop used to get, the old man with the bad cough, hairy knuckles, and sapphire eyes, how he sold us bread and broke our change into 50-cent pieces, pushing out phone cards and packing our brothers' blazer pockets with Lucy's. He had a suburban yard like us, but he'd converted his garage into a spaza shop, serving the neighborhood with bread, milk, and snuff. He'd installed an arcade machine at the rear, and we'd lean over the screen and curse all week, late to getting home, pumping our fists and sticking coins between the buttons to book the next play. It was a boxing ring and also where I'd meet the engineer. I was often in fights with him before we started throwing our matches and splitting wins. Each lighty from our neighborhood who cracked the machine had a favorite character whose mannerisms, those pixels from the East, would bleed inward, erupting in their limbs at moments of triumph. That was each lighty except me and the engineer, that is. Even though I'd started playing the game with Dragon, the two of us were shackled to mastering each character. Neither of us knew who we were, and we didn't feel safe enough to choose in front of people at the shop. That made us crack the machine harder than they did, birthing an audience. Later, lighties would cross town to crowd into living rooms where we sat in front of the machines of more fortunate sons, garlanded in their spoils and praise as we cracked consoles our mothers couldn't afford. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your work with us. I think we're all waiting with great anticipation, looking forward to reading the rest of that and to seeing your next novel when it comes out. And it's been a real treat to hear from you today. Thank you so much for coming along and sharing your thoughts and sharing your work. And I just want to say thank you on behalf of all the people that have attended today that unfortunately you're not able to see, but I know they're all there and really grateful for your work. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you for having me. It was really great.